things happen. And as always, thank you to Restream, our multi-streaming platform partner here. And they, of course, helped us get us the LinkedIn Live. So I'm really excited. I'm really excited to be on LinkedIn today. And I'm here today with Jenny Lisk. Jenny is the host of the Widowed Parent podcast, and she's also an entrepreneur. And we're going to talk to her today about a little bit of both. But first, Jenny, welcome.
Thank you. I've been looking forward to this. Yay. Hey, yeah. This is actually my first live stream, so
awesome.
I'm honored.
Well, thank you for being my guinea pig today.
Absolutely.
So how do you take your coffee? And if you drink coffee, how do you start your day?
Well, I'm in Seattle, so yes, I drink coffee. I drink it with milk, lots of milk, so it looks kind of, I don't know, light colored, I suppose. But I have to show you, I got out this mug just for you today.
Yay!
Zabar's. Yes, I used to live actually in New York, although sadly not in the city. I worked in Westchester County and lived there.
Okay, so not far.
Yeah, but I picked up a couple of these mugs while I was there, and they're my favorite. So, although they're small, I just wish they were a little bigger.
Nice. It's funny, we've had quite a few non-coffee drinkers on Coffee with Entrepreneurs, and I've never been able to kick the coffee habit, so I have my lavender oat milk latte here.
There you go.
And it's the perfect combination of picking you up and relaxing you, so I'm feeling good right now.
There you go.
Thank you for having coffee with me today.
Yeah, of course. Well, if we were at a coffee shop, I would get a caramel macchiato, but I'm not that fancy. I'm at home, so here we are.
Fair enough. So tell us where you are on your entrepreneurial journey.
Well, so I am... I guess about 2 years in. So I actually, back way up, I said I lived in New York. I worked there. I worked for a large tech company for about 20 years. And it's in September, it'll be 2 years that I made this cutover. And so basically I became a widowed parent, and I was really struggling with what, I got to do something in this space, right? Like, this is hard and there's not a lot of resources, but I wasn't sure, what that would look like and what I might do. And I really kind of also was looking to make a change anyway. I'd been 20 years in corporate IT, and I was like, just kind of wanted to, make a change. And so I was debating what to do. And then they actually kind of forced the issue. They were trying to consolidate people in offices, and they said, hey, we'd love to have you stay if you want to come back to New York. Otherwise, let's part ways. And so I said, well, this isn't really a good time for me to relocate back all the way across the country. All my family and everything's here. So I did two things. A little before that, I thought this might be coming. And so in the same week, I hired a resume coach because I hadn't done my resume in 20 years.
Yeah.
And I signed up for Dory Clark's Recognized Expert class and community.
Mm-hmm. Which is how we know each other.
Exactly. And see, this is funny. See, I'm looking at the camera so I can, look, but then I can't see your face. So
Right.
Anyway, I had been reading Dory's books. I first found her on a podcast, actually, and thinking, wow, I read Stand Out first, and I just thought that was incredible. And I took all these notes, and I was like, I got to do something. And it was helping me think about what to do in this widowed parenting space. Like, where could I make a contribution? What might this look like? And so then when things at work started to kind of shift, I thought, you know what? I will hire a resume coach, and I will join Dory's group, and I'll kind of throw everything against the wall and see what sticks.
Yeah.
And so that was kind of the start then. And I ended up starting this podcast. I was kind of, do I go back to school? How do I do this? And I realized that a podcast was a really accessible way to share, to go out and learn from experts and share back what I was learning with people like me. And then ultimately build that into some kind of business around other resources, writing, books, courses, things like that. So I'm kind of in the middle of all that.
That's great.
That's a long way of answering your original question.
That's fantastic. And what an interesting niche that you're in, because, so many single parents, widowed parents, they need your resources, right? What have been some interesting things that you've learned on this journey?
Well, gosh, how long do you have? I've learned so many things, whether it's, in terms of the subject matter itself from the guests that I've had on, and just the high-level experts that have been willing to speak to my listeners, whether it's on the topic of grief or on the topic of parenting more generally, because, widowed parents are still parents, and now they're only parents. They don't have their parenting partner, right? So also just general parenting advice. So, for example, Julie Lithcott-Hames, who wrote How to Raise an Adult, big TED Talk and all that, she came on the show. I was honored to speak to her and just share, her insights, which, of course, she's not a grief-specific author, but her insights then are so helpful to, if now I'm the only one raising my teenagers, how do I do this job better, right?
Right.
So some of those kind of people. And then, I've also learned a tremendous amount on the, I guess what you might call the business side of things, or the creating something out of nothing side of things. And, a lot of that I learned from watching people around me. For example, some of the people that you and I know through Dory Clark, they're all in different fields, right?
Right.
And they're all building something, and they're all doing really interesting and creative things. And, so by watching, I can learn and then adapt something, they did something this way, and maybe if I tweak it this way and add something else, it'll work for what I'm doing, or, so I think I'd be able to learn a lot that way too.
That's great. Yeah, of course, I've been a part of the Recognized Expert community for quite some time now.
Yeah.
And, it's funny, I just talked to Dory a little while ago, and I think if nothing else, right, the course is incredibly valuable. If nothing else, that community is so worth being a part of.
Oh yeah, for sure.
There's really great people in there, and everybody learns from each other, right?
Yeah. Oh yeah, definitely.
So, I know I've definitely learned a lot from you, just looking at how you've built this podcast and everything. So,
oh, thank you. Yeah, it's been interesting building it from scratch because, I started out knowing basically nothing about the field. Well, I didn't know anything about podcasting, but about the particular field that I was trying to podcast on, right? It wasn't like I already had 10 or 20 years of expertise that then I was drawing on to create a podcast. Right. And so I struggled with this early on. I really struggled. Like, I was excited about it, and people were telling me, you've got your story to share, it's, whatever. But I was like, why me? Like, why am I the right person to start this podcast? Or why does anybody want to listen to a podcast about widow parenting from me? Because I'm not a therapist, and I'm not a grief expert, and I'm not a fill in the blank, whatever you might think. And finally, I realized that was actually to my advantage. I kind of flipped it on its head. I said, I'm not an expert, so I don't have to pretend to be the expert. In fact, I shouldn't pretend to be the expert. It would be so much better if I said, I am a widowed parent like you, my listeners. I will stand in your place in this interview and bring some expert on, or some person to share their story or their reflections, and ask questions on behalf of my listeners. Think about, if I was one of these people out there listening, what might I want to ask this expert that I might not have a chance to speak to? And kind of approach it from that point of view. And then I can ask questions, and I can be curious on my own behalf and on my listeners' behalf. And that, I think, has turned out to be the right format. And it's allowed me to really shine a light on the work of all these people who are already doing excellent work in so many pieces of this puzzle, right? There's people doing great work in the children's grief field in terms of like running grief centers in every city around the country. There's people who run grief camps in the summer for 3 days where they have kids who've lost a parent or sibling come in. There's people who've written books on anxiety and parenting in general for different ages, and every piece of this puzzle, right? But the pulling it all together to say, what are some of these pieces of this puzzle that I, as a widowed parent, and my listeners as widowed parents might, want to know about, and kind of assemble that through the interviews each week into a show that I can put out in the world, has turned out to be. It's been the right approach for me, and listeners tell me that it's been helpful for them too.
Yeah, and I think you've hit on something that I think a lot of us go through as entrepreneurs, no matter what our space is, right? It's like, who am I to do this, right? Why am I the person to start a podcast about, I don't know, whatever it is, leadership or whatever the case is. Yeah. And, or even better, who am I to be an entrepreneur? I don't have an MBA. That's the kind of thing we hear a lot, right? And so
the funny thing is, I do have an MBA.
Oh,
not that it actually is helping with this at all. But anyway, I didn't mean to interrupt you.
No, it's great. That's great. And it's funny because, that's the kind of thing that I hear, like, there's a lot of the imposter syndrome thing about creating content. And, what I find, and I'm guessing you found this, and it sounds like you found this with your podcast, is that sometimes being the person who's not the expert, right, and being the person who's the conduit for all these great interviews, right, is the right. It's those create the best podcasts, I think.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't ever want to feel like I get on the show and I'm pontificating, right? I am telling you should do this, you shouldn't do that, right? I want to let my experts speak through their collected expertise and experience and wisdom and whatever they've put together, and let them tell people that. Right.
I love that. So what advice do you have for the widowed parents that may or may not be listening or may join us later?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I've actually got a whole list of 10 top things that I've learned from my guests that's available as a free download. But I guess a couple. If I had to pick out one, I would say it's to be honest with kids and not be afraid to talk to them about difficult topics. And it's hard because, you don't want to tell them that their dad is going to die, or you don't want to tell them, something. I was talking to someone the other day who said her husband had died in a house fire, and she didn't want to read the autopsy report, but ended up having to read it, and that she was hoping that her kids wouldn't find out basically some of the gruesome details, right? So it's, in other words, it's a very difficult topic that nobody wants to talk about. But what I've learned from talking to, interviewing all these people and reading all these books, is that kids end up finding out the truth eventually, somehow, some way, always, right? Like sometimes people will, let's say there's a particularly difficult type of death to acknowledge, like a suicide, a drug overdose, maybe a homicide, something you really don't want to talk to your kids about. Sometimes people will make up a cover story and say, your parent died of a heart attack. And they think they're protecting their kids. And maybe for the short term, it's easier in the short term, sure. But eventually they're going to find out because the other adults around them know, the other parents in the kids' school know. Maybe someday they're going to Google themselves or Google their parent and they're going to find out, or some extended family member is or you yourself are going to let slip sometime, right? And the problem is, even if they find out in a year or 10 years or when they're grown up, what it does is it ruptures that trust they had with the surviving parent. So it's like, if you already have an awful situation, one parent has died, and you think, how can I make this any worse, right? You can make it worse if the surviving parent lies to the kid about something important, and then eventually the kid finds out, and then they have one dead parent and a surviving parent that they no longer trust, if that makes sense.
It's funny. I went through something similar, and not a parent, but another family member who, they said, oh, she died of a heart attack, and it was actually something much worse, right? And it's funny you're saying this, because I actually found out, because this was in the time before Google, but when I was about 12, I learned, I found out. And man, what a paradigm shift, mean, now, of course, as an adult, I'm like, well, my parents are people, they're human, they tried, but also, how hard was that at 12?
Yeah.
So I love that advice.
Difficult age to learn that. Yeah. Well, and you're absolutely right. The parents are trying to do what they think is right. Every parent wants to protect their kids, right? So, when people around you were probably thinking, she's too young to know the truth, let's protect her, right? And it's really, if you don't know any differently, if you don't have a grief expert around you to give you advice on how to handle it, if you don't have somebody you can ask, you're kind of making it up as you go along. You do what you think is right. So, I'm not saying parents should beat themselves up about it. I'm saying that it's critical that good information get out there, right? Like a lot of this, too, we're learning in the last 10 and 20 years in the field. The stuff we didn't know about kids and grief and death, 30 and 40 years ago. And so I think, and that's one of the reasons why I'm doing what I'm doing, is there are so many widowed parents and who have now grieving kids. And, you know, there are great resources, and how can we get that to more of them to help them? Because it's, I got to tell you, and as I'm actually reflecting on this right now in the book that I'm writing, I felt so lost as a widowed parent. It's like, first of all, where do I even do, or what do I say, or how do I handle this? And secondly, who can even advise me on that? Right?
Yeah.
Like, because unless the people around you have been through a similar thing and already have the resources or the knowledge or something, the people around you probably have not had, you know, the same type of situation. And so maybe they know lots of things, but they don't know that particular, you know, children's grief field or, you know, advice. So that, I think, you know, I feel like through the podcast I can help bring that information to those people who need it, and hopefully help them feel a little bit less lost.
Do you feel that grief is changing now that we're in a global pandemic? Do you find that, you know, things are shifting with how we talk to kids about all this?
Well, that's an interesting question. Certainly grief is much more on the table these days as a topic, right? I mean, grief was always a topic because in a regular year, let's say this was a regular year, there's a certain number of people dying all the time, right? And so everybody has a certain, but for example, I didn't have anybody close to me die until I was like 25 years old, right? So, but now with this pandemic and so many more people getting sick and, you know, being afraid they might die, and or people actually dying, and or people not sick but, you know, worried that they might become sick. There's so much more, I think, grief and death around. It's a lot more likely that a kid might know somebody in an extended family or a community or a neighbor or a teacher or somebody, you know, so there's that aspect of more grief right now. And then also there's what they call like the non-death losses, right? Like the losses of what you expect. If you're expecting to graduate and have certain things happen, if you're expecting to have a wedding and you can't have that, right? There's grief, you know, comes up around a lot of those losses then that you have. So it's just, it's on so many more levels. It's so much more prominent right now. It's so much more on everybody's mind. So I've actually been busier than ever, you know, I finally baked a loaf of bread like last week. Right? I've been watching people on Facebook and Instagram, you know, putting their bread pictures for a month. Finally last week I was like, you know, I should, and it was a no-knead loaf, right? I didn't do any sourdough starter stuff. I was like, I can manage a no-knead loaf, 5 minutes to set it up, 5 minutes tomorrow to cook it. Right? But you know,
you finally did it. You finally had the downtime to like bake a loaf of bread.
Well, I wouldn't say I had downtime, but the thing is, so I don't know if you made the no-knead bread, and I was making it like 10 years ago all the time. Because it's super simple. Like you just I was actually fixing dinner and I was like, I should just set this up right now. You literally just mix the stuff together and leave it in the bowl overnight.
Yeah.
They're like 18 hours and then you cook it tomorrow.
Oh, wow.
Right. So yeah, there's no like time, you know, involved. It's really just a matter of planning. Like if I want bread tomorrow, I should start it today. That's the only, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's, you know, and I'm involved in this organization called the National Alliance for Grieving Children, which is a terrific organization, and it's a collection of all the people who run grief centers in the different cities and run grief camps and run different programs, and some individual people who provide, you know, children and family-related grief services are in this professional organization. And they have really stepped up in this pandemic time here too, in terms of like sharing best practices, sharing resources, helping each other figure out how to go virtual, how to go Zoom with all these things, right? And so, and I've been involved in all that, which has been really tremendous to see, you know, to learn more about what's going on, and then to be able to bring those resources to my listeners, because I have a lot of listeners, they'll email me or message me or whatever and say, oh, you know, I can't find any grief support, or maybe they're just assuming that everything's closed because of the pandemic, the quarantine, because usually the groups are in person, right? Once or twice a month, you get together in person with your age group and you do stuff, right? And so then I've been able to say, hey, you know, here's this list. I put together a list, right, of all these different groups that are doing virtual, in different locations. Some of them are open to people, regardless of location, out of state or whatever, and then some of them are just open to people who are local, who can go back when they open. But it's, I feel like during this few months here, it's, just the activity level around this, the number of, articles and stuff in the press and, excuse me. And, these children's and family grief programs are reporting now they're seeing new families come into their programs with COVID losses. At first it was still serving their existing clients, and now, they're bringing in new people. So it's sadly becoming a bigger and bigger topic. And I'm so glad that there are some of these resources in place already, and that they're, really stepping in to figure out how they can creatively fill some of these voids in this time.
Sure. So your daughter was at some point creating cards. Am I right about that?
She was, yes. We've actually stopped that now. But she's 13 now. She's an artist, and she was creating cards with her artwork to raise money for brain cancer research, which started when she was 10, I guess. I've kind of lost track of time. But, we were just talking about nothing much, really. And she said, when I grow up, I want to help raise money for brain cancer research. No, she said, I want to help cure brain cancer.
Wow.
And and so I was like, when you're a parent, you kind of try to draw them out, what did you have in mind? Are you thinking of being a doctor, nurse, researcher, like what you want to do? She said, no, I don't want to do any of the research and stuff myself. She said, I want to use my art skills to raise money for the people who are doing the research.
That's wonderful.
And this was about approaching a year after her dad died. So, he died in January, so it was approaching that first Christmas. And so so we're having this conversation, and I said, oh, that's great. You don't have to necessarily wait until you're an adult. You can do that later. Right. And if you want to do something smaller now, just try something, you can do that. So we talked about it, and she was like, I'm going to make Christmas cards and sell them. And at this point, it was not that much time left until Christmas, right? Yeah. So she runs up to her room. She makes 10 designs, snowmen and stuff. And she comes back, and she's like, okay, Mom, I've got my designs. Now, can you get these turned into cards? Right? And I was like, that's yes, wonderful. Okay, great, And it turns out that her school was having a holiday craft fair, and it was going to be 3 weeks later. And she had been wanting to do something at the craft fair, but hadn't really known what she wanted to do. So the ideas kind of came together. She could have a booth and sell these cards and raise the money for the brain cancer. And since it was at her school, this was the very same community that had been so supportive of us through the whole 8 months when my husband was sick. So they all knew, our journey and our story. They knew us because we'd been at school a long time. And so it worked out terrific. And so I then had to, speaking of entrepreneurship, this was micro, teeny tiny, on a micro scale entrepreneur, right? I had to figure out, all right, how am I going to get these printed? How should we price them? I don't know how much people would pay for a set of 10 cards made by a kid, right? But for a good cause. Right. And, how should we package them? I think that first time we just brought brown paper lunch sacks along and just stuck them in lunch sacks because we didn't have, anything. And it worked out great. And she made $500.
Wow.
Yeah, from that first, and actually she made a little less than that. And then she said, Mom, can I use my own money and round it up to 500 so that we can donate 500? Oh, so wow. Yeah, so I said, sure. What am I going to say to that, right? No, you can't do that. So, so then she said, okay, I want to take the money to Dr. Cobb's in person. And that was my husband's neurosurgeon at Swedish Medical Center, which is here in Seattle. And, but he's a practicing neurosurgeon, but he's also the lead researcher in this really interesting, they're actually finding a virus, speaking of viruses, virus cause for glioblastoma, which is the name of this particularly aggressive brain cancer. And once they get the virus figured out, then they can work on vaccines and stuff. So she says, I want to take him the money in person, right? And I'm thinking, okay, yes, but, he's super busy, right? He's got a full roster of patients and all this research. Right. So I just happened to notice that he was gonna be leading a tour of his lab, like the following week. And it was a day when school was getting out early anyway. I'm like, this is perfect. So I emailed them and I said, can we come on the tour? And by the way, my daughter's going to bring some money she raised. And like, oh, that's terrific. Yeah. And they probably thought it was $50 or something, right? Because when you say your 10-year-old raised money. Right. So anyway, so we showed up. She wanted to put the money in cash, of course, $100 bills in the envelope. And so we showed up and gave them the money. And then that kind of started, they invited us to lunch and to thank her, and we ended up putting a little website up and making some other like non-holiday cards to continue doing it. And we just stopped it this year, but in total we raised, gosh, I should have looked on the website ahead of time. It's like $5,000 or something, $6,000. I can't remember. A lot, yeah. And which we've donated all of that to Swedish for the research. So. Yeah, it was a good project to work on multiple levels, not only the helping the research, but also for her and me to have something to work on together. A very tangible thing, kind of an outlet for our grief. And also, I was having trouble focusing on work and stuff, right? Because my mind kept wandering, right? Like I'd be trying to focus on something here. Now I'm looking at my computer. You can't see that, but, and trying to work, and my mind would wander to like some flashback from the funeral or something, or flashback from emergency room visits.
Right.
And so being able to have this tangible, like, okay, I need to focus on creating a website for this fledgling card business, because I'm helping my daughter with her grief. Right. I'm helping myself too. But, as a parent, if you like doing something for your kid, it gives you extra motivation.
Sure,
right?
Sure.
So then I was able to focus. Like it was a task that was just enough of a stretch that I had to get into it, but not so much of a stretch that I couldn't do it, or that it felt too overwhelming or gave up, or anything like that. So that kind of taking action, I think, and doing it together with her ended up being a really useful grief tool, I guess, for lack of a better word, as well.
I love that. And she got a share from somebody who was really important, right?
She got a what? A letter?
Didn't she get a share or a letter or something from?
Oh, yeah. She got a letter from Joe Biden. So here's the thing. Right around the time my husband was diagnosed, and so we're sitting there in the hospital waiting for surgeries and doing all this stuff, the news comes out that Beau Biden had just died of brain cancer. Okay. And they didn't initially announce what type of brain cancer it was. They just said brain cancer. They later came back and said that it was glioblastoma, the same type. But just based on the way they were describing it and the, how his situation had gone, I thought it's probably the same brain cancer.
Right.
And so Joe Biden then, at the time, was still vice president, had given some interviews with various people, and one was with Stephen Colbert, and he talked about his grief throughout his life, both this and his first wife dying so many years ago, and his daughter, and how, he kind of gets up each day and puts one foot in front of the other. Sure. And keeps going. And so my daughter actually watched that video, that interview with Colbert, and was really touched by what he said. I think it was really helpful to her to see that here was a person who's had two tremendous tragedies, and he's kept going, and kind of, his words, I think, were just kind of inspiring for her. And so, and then he started doing the, supporting cancer research and funding and all that stuff. And so when she started doing this card work, she actually wrote him a letter. She did that. She used one of her cards and hand wrote it and invited him to come to the Seattle Brain Cancer Walk that was going to be in, I guess it was May of 2016, the first one that we went to, or the second one. I don't know, 17, one of those. And she sent him a letter and said, I'd like to invite you to come to the walk, and I'm raising all this money, and here's what I'm doing, and blah, blah, blah. And your talk with Stephen Colbert was so inspiring. Thank you, putting one foot in front of the other. And so he sent her back a letter. And she was so excited. And it was a long, it was a 2-page letter. And a bunch of it, of course, was your standard, paragraphs about how cancer research is so important. But at the end, they had kind of customized it and said, thank you, Megan, for getting up and putting one foot in front of the other, which was the same, thing that he had said in the interview that she had called out in her letter. And, thank you for the work you're doing on to fund brain cancer research and stuff. So that's still pinned up on our wall in the kitchen.
That's amazing.
Yeah, that was a really exciting day when that came in.
And I mean, not only is that wonderful for a 10-year-old to be thinking about, how can I help, fund this thing that, my dad, like the research so that more people don't die from it, right? Mm-hmm. That's not only the thing, but what a beautiful thing for her to do for her grief. Yeah. Well, and that was one of her big motivations. She said, I don't want any other families to go through what our family has gone through. Yeah. So, so we did that, and that was, each year we've gone to the Brain Cancer Walk and made an additional donation each year. And, yeah. That's lovely. I do want to open it up for questions. So if anybody is watching and has any questions for Jenny or, on the topic of entrepreneurship or podcasting or, widowed parenting or anything like that, feel free to type them in the chat. And, so I want to shift a little bit to talk about podcasting.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
Some questions to come in.
Absolutely.
What advice do you have for somebody who is just starting out and, might be saying, oh, it's going to be so much work, or, maybe it's such a saturated market or something like that. What do you have to say to that?
Well, I guess there's a couple different things there. I mean, on the saturated market thing, I think that totally depends what you're trying to do, right? If you're trying to make a podcast that, like, you're going to have Brene Brown numbers of listeners, like, you're probably not going to get a podcast like that. But, depending on what you're trying to do, like, for example, if you have a good niche that is easy to identify who your listeners should be or could be, right? Like, my listeners could be widowed parents who have kids they're still raising. So babies through college age. Mm-hmm. It's very defined. Like, if I tell you I have a podcast for that audience, you can say that's me or that's not me. Right? Or that's not me, but that is my colleague. I'll tell her about it. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Right? And so I think having a well-defined niche and having really clarity about what you're trying to do and why people in that niche would want to listen, what they would get out of it. Excuse me. I think is important and helpful. And, I'm not worried about anything being saturated in terms of, like, when I think about my own show. And actually, there are other grief podcasts out there, and they're starting to become more. I mean, I've seen other ones introduced since I started mine, but each show is different, right? There's a different format. Some have guests, some don't have guests. Some have, even if two shows have guests, they have different guests, or the host approaches it differently, or, and it's, and people who like podcasts also, like, for example, there's a podcast, Grief Out Loud, which is run by the Dougie Center in Portland. Terrific podcast. And they have guests and I have guests. We've actually been on each other's shows, which was terrific. But if you like podcasts and if you're grieving, you can listen to both shows because, you're driving around, you're walking around, you're cooking dinner. I mean, you can fit both shows on your plate. Sure. So that part, I'm not too worried about. And what was your other question? Oh, too much work. Yeah. Well, okay. It can be a lot of work. Mm-hmm. And there's a lot of variables there in how much work it's going to be. So, if you hire things out, obviously it's less work. I actually do everything myself. And that's because
yeah.
Well, yeah. And I mean, I'm at the point where, this is like revenue negative right now, right? Mm-hmm. So I'm not looking to hire people to do like editing for me. Sure. And, so I spent 20 years in tech. Did I do anything that was related to editing audio or producing shows or anything? No. But, I guess I feel like I can learn those things. I spent enough time in technology that it doesn't scare me off to think about learning these things.
Right.
And I think that, you can learn a lot from the people around you, right? When I was thinking about getting the show started and trying to shorten the learning curve, I picked a few podcasts that I liked and kind of broke down what they did and how they organized their show and how they did stuff. And then I kind of, used the best ideas from each to create a format that I thought would work for mine, that kind of thing. But, the thing actually I think that's the most work for me has nothing to do with the technical aspects or the parts that because you could hire out all those things, right? Mm-hmm. But the prep for the interviews, that's the part that's killing me. But I feel like it makes a better interview depending on who I interview. So if I kind of interview 3 categories of people, and one category is widowed parents who are experienced, who can share their journeys and reflections. And I've created a standard set of questions that I use as a starting point for them. Mm-hmm. And that saves a lot of time. And the second category is people who they're adults, but they lost their parent when they were young. So I have a different standard set of questions for them.
Sure.
And so for those 2 categories, I'll tweak the questions. If I know something, if they've done some writing that I can draw from to customize some questions. And of course, on the fly, as we have the discussion, I will,
of course,
if they bring something up, follow up or whatever. But that makes the preparation for those 2 types of interviews easier. It took me a while to realize that it was worth putting in the time to make a standard set. But the third type is these experts, and those are kind of one-off prep. They're, if they've written a book about this or a book about that, or they run this program, I end up spending a lot of time, I always read the book because, like I said before, I'm trying to stand in for my listeners and ask questions, so I don't want to miss something. If there's a really important part of their work that I think listeners would want to know about, I don't want to miss that by not reading the book and then not ask about it and then miss the opportunity when I've got this expert here talking to me to not share something that's really relevant. So, but part of it too, because like I said, I started this literally from scratch with, being a learner in the field myself and starting from a 0 baseline, all the prep I'm doing, I'm also learning. So it's not a bad use of time.
Sure.
In fact, it's a great use of time. It's just that it's a lot of time. So anyway, I have to figure out some ways to experiment with abbreviating some of that. But for me, it's a very long way of answering your question about someone who thinks it's too much work, and it can be, but there's so many variables, and that's the part that I find the most work.
Nice. I appreciate that because, it's funny. It's one of those things. Before I started a podcast, I was like, I will never do that. I was like I admire everybody doing a podcast. It's too much work. I'm not doing it. But of course, there are ways to cut down on your own work. Doing a live, for instance. That's an interesting. And I have not started experimenting with that. Mm-hmm. But I have sometimes experimented with just doing some live Facebook videos and then putting those on YouTube, because I'm like, it's like one and done. I record it, it's done. I stick it on YouTube. And I'm not messing around with like post-production and all this stuff. Right. It's like 2 seconds after it's done, it's posted and it's off my plate, right? Exactly.
There is some appeal in that, yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So you are writing a book.
I am,
Speaking
yes.
of books, tell us a little bit about that.
Well, okay, it's a memoir. And it is basically about my experience, parenting through my husband's terminal illness, which sounds like a depressing topic, but hopefully the book won't be. But so when he was sick for 8 months, I had a Caring Bridge journal, which Caring Bridge is that online, sometimes when people have a medical crisis or, a death, an emergency, and then they'll post updates on Caring Bridge. It's kind of like a quick way to create a blog for like a medical crisis. And so then they can share, all the family, all the friends, all the people who want updates. You're not trying to call all of them. You just post in Caring Bridge some update, right? Sure. Mm-hmm. And, originally I thought, I'll just text people and keep them up to date, and then it was like, okay, that's not happening. Because, and we were so lucky. We had a tremendous number of people who were really cared about us and what we were going through and wanted to, follow along and then supported us with food and so many other things. But point being, for the 8 months that he was sick, I had this Cambridge online journal, and it started out with like updates, like, you know, he's out of surgery and maybe he'll come home tomorrow, and just kind of matter of fact updates. But as I went through, it got more and more reflective. And so even, you know, in real time, I would stay up late and process what was happening and write some kind of a piece, you know, that was kind of a window into our experience.
Sure.
And so I realized later that when you took those 8 months of posts together, that it was kind of the backbone of a book. I kind of on a few levels, you know, but I realized when I combined it with some of the things I've learned since then through the podcast, that it's kind of a story of parenting through terminal illness, and how do you you know, kind of reflecting, like, what do I wish I had done differently, you know, regarding the kids, or I'm not saying this very well. What did I learn, you know, when I felt so lost at the time that I wish I had known at the time, that I think could help other people who are in a similar situation.
Sure.
And I think it's broader than just, you know, having a parent who's terminally ill, because it's really, in a broader sense, it's like parenting through a health crisis that has turned your world inward and upside down, which is kind of what's happening to a lot of people in this pandemic right now. You know, we're in a global health crisis, and everybody's worlds are turned inward and upside down.
And you still have to parent through that, right? Like, you know.
Right. And I was running around, you know, trying to take care of this doctor's visit and this CAT scan and this medication pickup and this phone call and this whatever, blah, blah, blah. And I had 2 kids who were 8 and 10 at the time, and a dog and a house and a husband to take care of, because he was incredibly ill.
Sure, yeah.
And because of the way the brain cancer affected him, I was like instantly a single parent. Right. He wasn't doing any parenting. He needed care. Yeah. So I'm reflecting on that, and what I'm actually doing, so the book's in 3 parts. Is the setup is part 1. Part 2 is the journal entries, then with reflections, you know, after each one. And then part 3 is the closing part, kind of since he died up to starting the podcast. And what I realized as I was thinking through this, and I was thinking through like the themes and what's the overarching message here, and I realized in a lot of sense it's a story about ultimately finding my voice by the end, you know. And it starts out, I mean, here we had, you know, normal prior world. I worked, he worked, we had 2 kids, we had a busy life. And then we had this 8-month situation. I started finding my voice through the blogging at the time, right? And then ultimately, at the end, started a podcast. Right. Which, you know, I mean, it's all about voice.
Right. You're literally using your voice.
Yeah. But also on a, you know, on a deeper level, like, I did my first interview now almost 2 years ago. And it was a stranger. I was hoping to interview my neighbor first, because she's also a widowed parent. And I thought, okay, if I interview her first and I forget to push record, or the sound is terrible, or I do a bad job of asking questions or anything, I could probably do it again, right? It's my neighbor, it's my friend. Yeah. But it didn't work out to interview her first. I interviewed a complete stranger first. Wow. And somebody I met on Instagram who does, you know, widowed coaching stuff. And I was like, oh. Okay, so I was trying to figure out how to ask good questions, right? Like, well, who's the best interviewer that I could think of? Well, of course, I got thought of Terry Gross, right? So I Googled how to interview like Terry Gross. And I read some really helpful stuff. And I'm not saying I'm doing anything like what Terry Gross does, but if I could take 1 or 2 of her, you know, ideas of what's made her a good interviewer and try to weave those in. So I had this first interview, and when I got off at the end, and by the way, totally lost track of time because we were just so engrossed in the conversation, right? And I got off and I was like, wow. Like, I just, you know, you might say, I just spent an hour and 20 minutes talking about death and grief and kids and hard stuff. And that's all true. But the connecting with this person about her story and the learning from her about her advice and, you know, all these things. When I was done, I was like, yes, like that's it. Like, this is the thing for me to be doing. Right?
I love that.
Like, it was just, and then as it turned out, I interviewed my neighbor later the same day. Mm-hmm. So I had 2 interviews on the first day, and then I was like, which might seem draining, right? But I was just like, I don't even know how to describe it. Like elated, maybe I guess is the term. And so in terms of like going back to like finding my voice, like that's where I felt like, okay,
this is what I'm supposed to be doing, right?
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
I love that. I love that. And I think it sounds to me like, you know, going through this pandemic, I mean, I don't have kids, and, you know, having been through grief, having been through things like, I can't imagine having to care for another person at the same time as, you know, a spouse is dying or whatever the case is, you know? So just, I think your resources are so important, because that's something that's really important, right? You still have to show up for your kids.
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard because, you know, anybody in that situation is juggling a lot. Yeah. And I was tremendously lucky to have, I mean, anything the kids needed as far as like logistical support, someone to watch them while I went to the hospital, someone to take them to soccer practice, someone to bring dinner, you know, any of that kind of stuff was, my friends and my family would just stepped right in and helped with all of those things. What I'm realizing, and so they seemed to me like, okay, the kids are taken care of, right? Because they got where they needed to go, and they were safe, and they were fed, and they were. But what I realized now that I wasn't doing was making the time to like start having those difficult discussions with them early on and frequently throughout. Right. I mean, like they knew what was going on. I told them, as you know, I always was honest with them, and I told them when the diagnosis came, the doctors couldn't fix it. Like, but as we went through, I wish I had initiated more discussions. Like, you know, wow, that must have been really hard for you today when this happened, or you know, it seems like you're handling this really well, but I guess it must be really, I don't know, fill in the blank, scary, sad. You know, and kind of letting them start to talk about those emotions earlier. I think I was so relieved that kind of checked that box. Like, all right, the kids are getting to school and the kids are getting fed and they're doing the things they need to do. And I was dealing with so many things, right? I mean, we had so many ER visits. I was just working on reviewing a part of the book last night where I said we had 4 ER visits in a week.
Jeez.
Right.
Wow.
So, I mean, this was the kind of 8 months that were going on, right? And so you can imagine if I'm running around and doing all these things, that I was just relieved that the kids are being taken care of.
Right. Right.
But that next step of having the, you know, maybe it was having the energy, maybe I think it was more, I didn't have the knowledge to know that it was important to be initiating those conversations, difficult as they would be. And I really wish that I had started initiating those sooner, because I think it would have helped them, you know, in the bigger picture. I
love that. And congratulations on your book, and the podcast is a really big
Thank
success.
you.
And
Thank you. The book is going to launch in October. So, awesome. And actually you're catching me right now in the, I'm trying to get it to the editor by the end of the week. So this is a nice break to, come and talk to you and had stop getting my pen, you know.
Yes. That's awesome. So, well, how can people get in touch with you and stay in touch with you to find out, you know, be a part of the launch?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, so my website is jennylisk.com. So it's JENNYLISK.com. That's probably the portal to finding everything. If you're interested in the book, you know, getting on the launch team, if you go to the page, it's actually /memoir, but if in the menus, you can also find under books, you can find memoir, and you can fill out, you know, a little bit of information. I'm doing video updates on like, you know, writing updates periodically, kind of giving, you know, what's happening. And, in fact, probably my next writing update, I'm going to share my new opening sentence. Nice. I revised the opening. The opening originally was kind of okay, but in hindsight, it was really kind of not, it didn't really pull you in.
Sure.
And I spent like 2 hours thinking and 5 minutes writing a new opening sentence. So I'm going to give a little sneak peek of that in my next video update.
Nice.
So you can, and the launch team, of course, will get, behind the scenes updates as we go. And I keep getting distracted from the editing because I keep thinking of all these exciting marketing ideas. I've been keeping a document as I go, but I'm planning a whole thing around little free libraries and a whole live streaming thing. Because, now I'm doing a virtual book launch, right? Yeah. So anything I might have done last year is out the window. Maybe I can do some of those things, after the pandemic. But I'm trying to think of all these really fun and creative things. So the launch team, I'm very excited about, ways that they can help if they want to help get the word out. And, the podcast, of course, is on all of the podcast, Apple Podcasts and Google Podcasts and Spotify. And it's called the Widowed Parent Podcast. Mm-hmm. It's in all those places. And social media everywhere. I'm at Lisk Jenny on all the platforms. And I should say, for people who are listening who are not widowed parents, I have a page on my website of what I call tips for allies. So this is people, the friends, the family, the neighbors, the colleagues, the people who have someone in their life who, I've really written it, specifically for someone who's a widowed parent, but most of it, honestly, is applicable if you have someone close to you who's grieving. And so, because there's a lot of what do you say? What don't you say? How can you help? Because, everyone says, let me know if there's anything I can do to help, which it turns out isn't really all that helpful and they're trying to be helpful and they don't want to step on anybody's toes, right? But it turns out it's a lot more helpful to suggest, can I walk your dog tomorrow? And then the person can say yes or no, right? But so anyway, I put together a whole bunch of tips like that, and hopefully most of your listeners today or your viewers today are not widowed parents, so hopefully they won't need my podcast, although maybe they know somebody who does. But anybody, I think, the tips for the allies, people have told me it's really helpful. And so jennylisk.com/allies-tips. There's
/allies-tips.
Yeah. I think I'm going to revise that so I can take the dash out because it's a little hard to say. But yes, that's it. And so and of course there's I've got a download there with another, 10 or 15 pages of tips. But right on that page is a good intro. And then in some videos, I did a video of how to write a condolence card because you know what? Everyone has to write condolence cards. And now everybody has to write more condolence cards. And nobody wants to write them because you don't know what to say. Right? Because you want to make it better for the person, and you can't actually fix it. So then you don't know what to say. I would always maybe I'll think of the right thing later and kind of procrastinate and then maybe never send it. Right?
Right. Yep.
But I learned a lot from going through this experience. So I put together, a video with some tips on that, and that's on that page too. So that's kind of the starting point for everything related to how to support people around you who are grieving.
I love that. I had a friend, when I was in my 20s, I had an older mentor who was actually terminal with colon cancer. And he sent out an email, here's what not to ask me. Don't talk to me about your, miracle cure. At some point he decided no more chemo, no more drugs, no more anything. Right. Don't come to me with a cure. Don't feel like you need to talk. Don't ask me how I'm doing. Don't ask me if I'm praying. He had all these things. Because you're right. It's so easy to say the wrong thing. Right. And you mean well, or it's so easy to say nothing, even if you want to say, you want to say something. Right. Yeah. So this is helpful.
Well, and, the most important thing really is just to let someone know that you're there and you care. Right. There's nothing you can say that's going to fix it anyway. Yeah. Right? Yeah. So, but just knowing, this person who's my friend, they know and they care and they're here and they're not going to run away when it gets scary or uncomfortable. That's really all you can do, and that's really all you need to do. Yeah. I love that. I love it. So, Jenny, thank you so much for being here with me today. Thank you for being my first LinkedIn Live. Yeah, this has been so fun. I love this. Now I'm very excited about live streaming for my book launch, I hope. Awesome. Yeah, and you'll have to come back when we're close to the launch because I would love to. We'll want to get lots and lots of people buying the book and everything. So thank you. I'd love to do that. Yeah, and thank you for organizing this. This has been a fun series. I've been watching some of your talks on other days with before you were on LinkedIn though, but on the other platforms. So now I'm so glad that you're here and you can reach all of your audience this way too.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. All right.
All right. Thank you.
Have a great day.